Every Tuesday, just after sunrise, the same battered trailer idles at the loading dock of an orchard that can't get rid of its garbage apples. Bruised galas, split Honeycrisps, fruit so riddled with scars even the juice plant won't take it. The workers call Elena Okonkwo the compost queen, not to her face, but loud enough to hear. She takes every last one for free, pulls away with a mountain of what everyone else calls worthless, and never says a word. What she's doing with them is something the entire industry laughed at, until her vinegar started outselling the orchard. Elena Okonkwo is 29, a microbiologist who never worked in a lab, living alone in a rented farmhouse with a cellar that reeks of fermentation. 3 years ago, she had only a battered trailer and a question nobody had asked. What if the rejected apples were the most valuable ones? The answer starts with a year of catastrophic failure, a secret buried in the oldest trees, and a foreman who bet she wouldn't last the month. The foreman's name was Ray Caston, and he'd been at the orchard 22 years. He'd seen every kind of hustler roll up to the loading dock, people wanting free firewood, free deer apples, free anything. When Alina appeared with her dented trailer in September of the first season, he assumed she was another bottom feeder. He waved at the pile of bruised galas and split jonagolds and said, "Lady, you want 'em, they're yours. Don't come crying when the yellow jackets take over." Then he laughed, not unkindly, but in the way a man laughs when he's certain he's doing someone a favor they won't understand yet. The other workers picked up the joke. Compost Queen. That was the name. They'd say it just loud enough for her to catch as she strapped down the tarp. She never flinched. She never explained why a 29-year-old with a microbiology degree she'd never used would haul half a ton of rotting fruit back to a rented farmhouse whose cellar already reeked of failed experiments. She just pulled the straps tight, thanked them, and drove away. To understand why she took the apples, you have to go back to a lecture hall she hadn't thought about in 7 years. Lena had studied fermentation microbiology under a professor named Dr. Adebio, a woman who opened every course with the same line. Civilization was built on controlled rot. The class learned how wild yeast colonizes fruit skins, how acetic acid bacteria convert alcohol into vinegar when given oxygen, how the most complex flavor compounds in fermented foods come from exactly the kind of stress microorganisms experience on bruised, overripe, discarded produce. Alina absorbed all of it, earned top marks, and then took a job coordinating clinical trials for a pharmaceutical company because it paid the bills. The microbiology gathered dust. She moved into the rented farmhouse outside Medford 2 years later, not because she had a plan, but because the pharmaceutical job had hollowed her out and the lease was cheap. The cellar smelled of old apples when she arrived. The previous tenant had tried making cider and given up. Something about the smell stirred a memory. Dr. Adebio's voice insisting that the very things we throw away are where the most interesting biology lives. When she drove past the orchard one afternoon and saw a sign advertising clean fill, she asked the office if they ever needed to get rid of unsellable fruit. That call went to Ray Caston, who'd never had anyone request his garbage before. He said yes so fast he nearly forgot to ask her name. The first year nearly broke her. She crushed the apples in a hand-cranked press she bought at auction, filled every food-grade bucket she owned, and waited. Wild yeast showed up on schedule, converting sugar to alcohol. Then the Acetobacter died. Entire batches stalled because she'd left them too cold, too sealed, too neglectful of the fact that the bacteria needed oxygen, not just sugar and time. She opened one bucket to find a gray mat of mold so thick it held its shape when she peeled it off. Another batch fermented so aggressively that the vinegar stripped the inner lining off a steel drum, leaving behind a liquid that smelled like industrial solvent. She poured it into the weeds behind the barn, and the weeds were dead within a week. She didn't quit. She started keeping handwritten logs, sugar content, pH, ambient temperature, apple variety. She tested fruit from different parts of the massive orchard, comparing the modern blocks of Gala and Fuji with an abandoned corner the workers called the Old Patch. That section was planted in winesaps, a variety no commercial orchard would put in today, gnarled trunks, small, irregular fruit, skin so russeted it looked diseased. The agronomist had written them off decades ago, but the trees still produced, and their apples got dumped with the rest. Alina crushed a batch from those trees, fermented it carefully with cloth covers and nightly pH checks, and the first time she tasted the finished vinegar, she didn't laugh or cry or call anyone. She just sat on the cellar steps and closed her eyes. The vinegar had a depth she couldn't describe in scientific terms, yet smoky, tannic, a structure that lingered on the palate like aged balsamic, not thin and sharp like her earlier batches. The wine saps, stressed and abandoned, had produced phenolic compounds that modern breeding had erased from sweeter varieties. The garbage fruit was not garbage at all. It was the most valuable thing on the entire orchard, and she was the only person who knew it. She didn't sleep that night. The vinegar from the winesap batch sat in a glass jar on her kitchen counter, catching the light from the stove hood like dark amber. She had tasted it at 9 in the evening, and by midnight she had already written 3 pages of notes comparing it to everything she could find online about commercial apple cider vinegars. None of them described the complexity she was tasting. No one was marketing a vinegar made from abandoned heritage fruit, because no one had thought to test whether the rejects were chemically superior. She had stumbled onto something that the entire gourmet food industry had missed, and she had done it with fruit the orchard paid to get rid of. The next morning, she drove back to the loading dock with a specific request. She asked Ray Caston to set aside only the apples from the old patch, not the drops from the modern blocks, not the bruised galas or the split Honeycrisps, just the gnarled, russeted winesaps that nobody wanted. Ray squinted at her like she'd asked him to sort garbage by hand. He said it would slow down the crew. She offered to come earlier and separate them herself. He shrugged and told her to be there by 6 if she wanted to dig through the pile before the trucks hauled the rest to compost. She was there at 5:45 the next Tuesday, and every Tuesday after that for the next 2 months. The second discovery came during those cold mornings, sorting apples by headlamp while the orchard workers watched from the warmth of the processing shed. She noticed that the winesap fruit from the north end of the old patch, where the soil was thinner and the trees competed with a stand of black walnut, produced vinegar with an even more pronounced smokiness. Stress was not just a metaphor. The trees that struggled hardest concentrated their phenolic defenses in the fruit, and those compounds survived fermentation intact. She started keeping separate batches, north end, south end, trees near the drainage ditch, trees on the ridge. Her logbook filled with tasting notes. North batch, November 3rd, leather, dried cherry, finish like peated whiskey. She was no longer making vinegar. She was making something closer to wine. By month 10, she had a dozen barrels aging in the cellar, each labeled with the exact tree row and harvest date. She'd learned to cultivate a mother, the gelatinous raft of cellulose and acetic acid bacteria that floats on the surface, and to transfer a portion of it to each new batch to kickstart fermentation. She'd stopped guessing at pH and sugar content. She bought a refractometer, a proper pH meter, and a notebook with waterproof pages because the cellar humidity ruined everything else. The failures didn't stop, but they changed. They were no longer catastrophes. They were data points. One barrel turned because she'd left it too close to the furnace. Another developed a calm yeast pellicle that she learned to skim off before it imparted off flavors. Each mistake taught her a variable she hadn't controlled for, and the vinegar that survived was getting better every month. The first person outside her own kitchen to taste it was a chef named Marcus Delgado, who ran a tiny restaurant in Ashland that had a 6-month waiting list. Alina had eaten there once, years earlier, on a date she barely remembered but the food she'd never forgotten. She knew Marcus sourced everything locally, that he built his menu around whatever farmers brought him that week. She called the restaurant 7 times before he picked up. He listened to her 30-second pitch, said he got a dozen calls like this every month, and agreed to a tasting mostly to get her off the phone. She drove to Ashland with 3 sample bottles and a loaf of sourdough to neutralize his palate between varieties. Marcus tasted the North Block winesap vinegar on a torn piece of bread, set the spoon down, and stared at her for a long 5 seconds. Then he asked how much she could deliver by the end of the month. That single question changed the arithmetic of her entire operation. She needed more barrels, more bottles, a commercial kitchen license she had never researched, and liability insurance she couldn't afford. She needed to turn a cellar experiment into a business without losing the quality that had made Marcus stop talking. She called the local health department and spent 3 hours on the phone learning about food processing permits. She found a used stainless steel bottling tank on an auction site and drove 200 miles to pick it up in a rental truck. She hired her first employee, a retired orchard hand named Pete who had pruned trees on that same farm for 30 years and knew the old patch better than anyone alive. He told her the winesaps had been planted in 1953 by a previous owner who had planned to make cider but died before his first harvest. The orchard never bothered to tear them out because the land was low-lying and hard to replant. The trees had been an afterthought for half a century. To Alina, they were now the entire business. By the end of year 2, she had moved from the cellar to a converted equipment shed she leased from a farmer down the road. She had 4 fermentation tanks, a small bottling line, and Pete working full-time. Marcus Delgado's restaurant was buying all the vinegar she could produce, but his orders were too small to scale on their own. She needed more customers, and she needed them fast because the lease on the shed was chewing through her savings. She started cold emailing specialty grocers with a single photograph of her bottle and a one-sentence subject line. "This vinegar is made from apples your suppliers throw away." The responses trickled in: a farm store in Eugene, a cheese shop in Portland, then a distributor who stocked gourmet markets across the Pacific Northwest. Each new order pushed her production capacity to its limit and forced her to go back to Ray Casden with an awkward request. She needed more of the garbage apples, specifically the winesaps, and she needed them consistently. Ray didn't laugh this time. He asked her how much she was selling that vinegar for, and when she told him the price per bottle, he went quiet. He was a man who had spent 2 decades watching the orchard's profit margins shrink as supermarket chains squeezed wholesale prices lower every season. The orchard was making pennies per pound on the apples that went to market and losing money on the ones that went to compost. Alina was turning the compost into a premium product, selling for more per ounce than the orchard's best fresh fruit fetched per pound. Ray did not congratulate her. He told her the orchard's owners would want to have a conversation, and he didn't say it like it was a good thing. The meeting was set for the following week with the orchard's general manager, a woman named Susan Harwood who had run the operation since her father retired and who had never met a liability she couldn't foresee. Alina arrived with a sample bottle and a pitch. She wanted a guaranteed supply of winesap apples at a below-market rate, and in exchange, she'd continue taking the rest of their rejects for free, saving them thousands a year in disposal costs. Susan listened, tasted the vinegar, and then told Alina something that landed in the room like a stone. The orchard had already filed permits to clear the old patch. The winesaps were coming out at the end of the season, bulldozed to make room for higher density plantings of modern varieties that actually turned a profit. They had planned it 2 years ago. They just hadn't gotten around to it yet. Alina had exactly 1 harvest left before the trees that made her vinegar possible were reduced to firewood, and Susan was not offering to change the schedule for free. Susan leaned back in her chair and named her price. The orchard would spare the winesaps for exactly 2 more seasons if Alina agreed to 3 conditions. First, she would pay a per-ton fee for the fruit, wiping out the free arrangement she'd built her margins on. Second, she would allow the orchard to co-brand her vinegar under their farm stand label, giving them a cut of every bottle sold. Third, she would share her production logs, her fermentation notes, her pH data, her tasting records, everything she had learned over 2 years of solitary trial and error. Susan did not blink when she said it. She knew the value of what Alina had, and she knew Alina had nowhere else to go. Alina asked for a week to think about it. She drove home, sat in the equipment shed among her barrels, and did the math. If she agreed to Susan's terms, her margins would shrink to almost nothing for the first year. If she refused, the winesaps would be gone by spring, and she would be left scrambling to replicate her vinegar with whatever random fruit the orchard sent her. The flavor would change, the consistency would collapse, and the chefs who had started to trust her product would walk away. It was not really a choice. It was a hostage negotiation over trees that had been planted before she was born. She called Susan on the fourth day and said yes, with one counter condition. She wanted access to every abandoned block of heritage fruit the orchard still had, not just the wine saps, old northern spies, Arkansas blacks, trees that had been left unpruned for decades and whose fruit currently rotted on the ground every autumn. Susan laughed, not unkindly this time, and agreed. The orchard wasn't using them anyway. The announcement that the compost queen had signed a co-branding deal with the orchard sent a ripple through the valley. Ray Caston heard it from a coworker and didn't say a word. He just loaded the trailer the following Tuesday and waved as Alina pulled away. The teasing stopped that morning, and it never came back. The first co-branded bottles hit the farm stand cooler in late October, just as the wine saps were dropping their final fruit. The label read Haverson Heritage Reserve in a typeface Susan had paid a designer to choose, and underneath, in the smallest print allowed by law, the words fermented by Millbrook Reserve Vinegar. Alina had fought for that line. Susan didn't care either way. She was already fielding calls from distributors in Portland and Seattle who had never once called about the orchard's fresh apples. By year 3, Alina's vinegar was on the tasting menu at 9 restaurants and shelved in 30 specialty grocers across 3 states. Marcus Delgado built a dessert around it, a poached pear dish that got written up in a regional food magazine. The article mentioned the vinegar by name, traced its origin to the abandoned wine saps, and the week it ran, Alina's online orders tripled. She hired a second employee to handle shipping, then a third to manage the fermentation logs she could no longer track alone in her waterproof notebook. Then the numbers flipped. 6 months into year 3, the orchard's general manager, Susan, called Alina with a tone she had never used before, careful, measured, the voice of someone who has just been handed a spreadsheet she doesn't like. The co-branded vinegar had crossed a threshold. Its gross revenue for the quarter had outpaced the orchard's own fresh apple sales, not including wholesale compacts, just the direct-to-consumer farmstand numbers. The garbage apples, the rejects, the fruit the orchard had paid to haul away, were now generating more money per season than the premium fruit they'd been growing for 3 generations. Susan asked if Alina would be open to renegotiating the co-branding terms. Alina said she would, but this time she named her own price. She offered to pay the orchard a flat licensing fee to use their heritage fruit exclusively, a fee that exceeded what they'd ever made selling those apples fresh. In exchange, she would own the Millbrook brand outright, no co-label, no profit split. The orchard would become her supplier, not her partner. Susan sat with the offer for exactly 1 day before she accepted. The alternative was losing the entire arrangement to a competitor, because Alina had quietly begun conversations with 2 other orchards in the region whose oldest trees were still standing. The foreman who had laughed at the compost queen now loaded the trailer with the same apples he once dumped, and he didn't laugh anymore. He just pulled the tarps tight and waved as the truck pulled away, carrying fruit that had been worthless 3 years ago and was now worth more per pound than anything else on the farm. The piles behind the barn had stopped being a joke. They had become the orchard's most reliable revenue stream, and the woman nobody believed in had revenue that passed theirs, a waiting list she couldn't keep up with, and a cellar full of vinegar aging in barrels marked with names the orchard had nearly forgotten. The wine saps were safe because she had made them too profitable to destroy. By the 4th harvest season, the woman they once called the compost queen stood in a production facility that hummed through the night. 5 employees, 6,000 square feet of racked barrels, and a waiting list of restaurants from Portland to San Francisco that she had stopped keeping on paper because it outpaced her ability to update it. The dented trailer that had carried her first load of rejects sat parked behind the building. She kept it there, rusting at the hitch, an artifact she walked past every morning without needing to explain to anyone. Ray Caston retired at the end of that season. At his farewell barbecue, he stood up in front of 30 orchard workers and their families, holding a bottle of Millbrook Reserve in one hand, and told a story about a young woman who showed up with a trailer and a question nobody else had ever asked. He didn't call her compost queen. He called her the smartest person who ever pulled up to his loading dock. Then he bought a case for his daughter, who was opening a bakery in Medford, and told her to put Alina's vinegar in everything. The neighbor who had once slowed his truck to gawk at the rotting pile behind the barn stopped by the production facility one afternoon in early November. He didn't come to apologize. He came with a checkbook. He had tasted the vinegar at a friend's dinner party, recognized the label, and wanted to buy a pallet for his distribution company's holiday gift boxes. Alina poured him a sample spoon, answered his questions exactly the way she answered every other customer, and wrote up the invoice without mentioning that she remembered his face from 4 years earlier, idling at the end of her driveway, shaking his head. The former classmate who had posted the mocking photo of the apple pile took it down sometime in year 3 and replaced it with a shot of a charcuterie board featuring a bottle of Millbrook Reserve in the corner. Tagged, hashtagged, no irony. Alina never mentioned the original post, and she never brought it up when that same classmate ordered a subscription shipment 2 weeks later. The shelf space did the talking. The science that had started as a cellar obsession found its way into public view in year 4, when a food chemistry journal published a study comparing commercial vinegars by phenolic profile and antioxidant concentration. The researchers included Millbrook Reserve as a benchmark alongside balsamics aged for 12 years. The winesap vinegar measured higher in chlorogenic acid and epicatechin than any other apple vinegar in the study, compounds linked to the same kind of cellular stress response that made the trees themselves produce them in the first place. The fruit had not known it was supposed to be worthless. The biochemistry had never gotten the memo. The orchard that once paid to haul those apples to compost now paid Alina a licensing fee to use Millbrook Reserve in its own farmstand products, marinades, shrub syrups, a vinegar-based spritzer that sold out 3 weekends in a row. The agronomist who had written off the winesaps as obsolete decades earlier came out of semi-retirement to walk the old patch with her, pointing at trees he had recommended for bulldozing and listening, while she explained why each one produced a different flavor profile. He told her near the end of the walk that he had spent a career optimizing orchards for yield and never once considered optimizing for flavor complexity. She told him it wasn't too late to start. The revenue milestone arrived quietly on a Tuesday morning in October when her accountant called and said the numbers for the quarter had just crossed the orchard's direct-to-consumer sales. Not their wholesale volume, not their juice compacts, just the farmstand revenue, the same metric that had once seemed untouchable. Alina hung up the phone and walked out to the loading dock, where a delivery of Northern Spy apples from the orchard's oldest surviving block was coming off the truck. She stood there for a minute, watching the fruit tumble into the receiving bins, and thought about her professor's lecture from 10 years earlier. Civilization was built on controlled rot. The most interesting biology lives in the things we throw away. The compost queen was never a punchline. It was a job description she had been the only applicant for. And somewhere in the Rogue Valley right now, another truck is probably pulling onto another farm, carrying another load of something everyone has already decided is done, finished, past saving. Most people will drive by without noticing. A few will laugh. One of them might stop. What the story was never really about was vinegar. It was about a way of seeing that most people never learn to trust. Discarded fruit, like discarded effort, doesn't know it's supposed to be worthless. A woman with a microbiology degree she never used remembered a professor saying that the most interesting biology lives in the things we throw away. She drove that sentence into a mountain of rotting apples and refused to stop until it made sense. The orchard workers called her a punchline. The valley laughed at piles of fruit they assumed would rot into nothing. But the fruit never got the joke. It just kept producing the kind of complexity that only comes from surviving difficult conditions, and one person was paying close enough attention to notice. The composter, the fermenter, the person willing to tend what everyone else has abandoned. These are not the romantic figures of startup mythology. They work in cold barns with flashlights clenched between their teeth. They ruin batches and write down why. They show up before sunrise to sort garbage apples by tree row. And if they are very patient and very stubborn, the garbage eventually becomes the one thing nobody else can replicate, because nobody else was willing to spend the time it takes to understand why something was thrown away in the first place. If this story made you look at something you were about to give up on a little differently, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments about a time you found value where nobody else was looking. Share this with someone who's in the middle of their own ugly, unglamorous, nobody believes in it season. They need the reminder that the messiest looking chances are sometimes the best ones. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight.